The first rock appeared on the porch on a Tuesday morning in early April, wet with morning dew and caked with the rich black soil that characterized the forests of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Thomas Hartley almost tripped over it on his way to the woodpile, his attention focused on the coffee mug in his hand rather than the path his feet were taking. He looked down at the stone, then at his dog Jasper, who was sitting nearby with an expression that could only be described as proud.
"What's this, boy?" Thomas asked, bending down with the careful movements of a man whose body had been through more than it was designed to handle. His knees protested as he lowered himself, the old shrapnel wounds in his left thigh sending their familiar signals of displeasure. He picked up the rock and examined it in the pale morning light. It was about the size of his fist, roughly spherical, with an unusual weight that seemed disproportionate to its dimensions. The surface was dark gray, almost black, with veins of something lighter running through it in irregular patterns. It wasn't like any rock Thomas had seen in his years of living on this mountain, and he had walked these woods countless times since he'd bought the property 15 years ago. Jasper wagged his tail, clearly pleased with himself. He was a mixed breed, part golden retriever and part something else that no one had ever been able to identify, with a coat that was more orange than gold and eyes that held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved people who didn't know him. Thomas had found him at a shelter in Asheville 6 years ago, a scrawny, frightened dog who had been surrendered by owners who claimed they could no longer afford to keep him.
Something about the way Jasper had looked at him through the bars of the kennel had spoken to Thomas, had reminded him of the way his fellow soldiers used to look when they were trying to hide their fear. He had signed the adoption papers that same day.
"Where did you find this?" Thomas asked, turning the rock over in his hands. The question was rhetorical, of course. Jasper couldn't answer in words, though sometimes Thomas suspected the dog understood far more than he let on. "Did you go into the woods again?" Jasper's tail wagged faster, confirming the suspicion. The dog had a habit of disappearing into the forest that bordered Thomas's property, sometimes for hours at a time, returning with scratches on his nose and burrs in his fur, and the satisfied air of a creature who had been doing important work. Thomas had worried about this habit at first, concerned that Jasper might encounter bears or coyotes or any of the other dangerous wildlife that called these mountains home. But over the years, he had come to accept it as part of who Jasper was. The dog had his secrets, his private journeys into the wilderness, and Thomas respected that. He had his own secrets, after all. He tossed the rock aside, into the pile of debris that had accumulated near the edge of the porch, and went about his morning routine. Coffee, breakfast, the slow process of stretching muscles that had grown stiff overnight. At 63 years old, Thomas was beginning to feel every one of the decades he had spent serving his country. 25 years in the Army, including 3 tours in Vietnam and 2 more in the Gulf, had left him with a body that functioned, but never without complaint. The shrapnel was just the beginning. There were the burns on his back from an explosion that had killed 2 of his closest friends. There was the hearing loss that made conversation difficult in crowded places. And there were the invisible wounds, the ones that no doctor could see on an X-ray, the memories that came unbidden in the quiet hours and filled his dreams with fire and screaming. He had come to these mountains to find peace, to escape the noise and chaos of a world that seemed to have moved on without him. His wife, Patricia, had died 8 years ago from a heart attack that had struck without warning, leaving him alone in a house that suddenly felt too large and too empty. For 2 years he had tried to carry on in their suburban home in Virginia, maintaining the routines they had established over 3 decades of marriage, pretending that the silence didn't crush him a little more each day. And then, one morning, he had woken up and known with absolute certainty that he couldn't do it anymore. The cabin in the Blue Ridge had been a dream they had shared, Patricia and him, something they had talked about during the long years of his deployments and the slow process of his recovery after each one. A place in the mountains, they had said, away from everything, where they could finally be at peace. She had never gotten to see it, but Thomas had built it anyway, pouring his grief into the construction like mortar between stones. He had done most of the work himself, learning as he went, making mistakes and fixing them, creating something that was rough around the edges but undeniably his.
The second rock appeared 3 days later. Jasper deposited it in the same spot on the porch, right where Thomas was sure to find it on his way to the woodpile. This one was slightly larger than the first, with the same dark gray color and the same unusual weight. Thomas picked it up and examined it more carefully this time, turning it over in his hands, feeling its heft and texture. There was definitely something strange about these rocks, something that nagged at the edge of his consciousness without quite resolving into a clear thought. He looked at Jasper, who was watching him with that expression of canine satisfaction. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you, boy?"
Jasper barked once, a sound that might have been affirmation. Thomas set the rock beside the first one and went about his day, but the stones stayed in his mind, a puzzle that demanded to be solved. That evening, after dinner, he pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about the geology of the Blue Ridge Mountains, trying to identify what kind of rocks Jasper had been bringing him.
The search was frustrating at first. The Blue Ridge was home to countless types of rocks and minerals, the result of geological processes that had been unfolding for billions of years. There were granites and gneisses, schists and slates, the remnants of ancient mountains that had been worn down and rebuilt countless times over the eons. But none of the pictures Thomas found online quite matched what Jasper had brought him. He was about to give up when he stumbled across an article about tungsten ore. The article explained that tungsten was one of the heaviest natural elements, used in everything from light bulb filaments to military armor. It was rare and valuable, mined primarily in China and Russia, though there were scattered deposits throughout the world. The ore that contained tungsten was called wolframite, and it was characterized by its dark color and unusually high density. Thomas looked at the two rocks sitting on his porch, feeling his heart begin to beat faster. Could it be? Could Jasper have stumbled across something valuable during his wanderings in the woods? He spent the next hour reading everything he could find about tungsten and wolframite, learning about the properties of the ore and the methods used to identify it. The more he read, the more convinced he became that what Jasper had brought him was the real thing. The color was right, the weight was right, even the veins of lighter material that ran through the rock matched the descriptions of tungsten ore. But he needed to be sure. The next morning, he drove into town and visited the local library, where he found a book on mineral identification that included tests for various types of ore. Armed with this knowledge, he returned home and began the process of confirming his suspicions. The tests were crude, limited by his lack of proper equipment, but they were enough to tell him what he needed to know. The rocks were dense enough to sink immediately in water, ruling out lighter minerals. They were non-magnetic, ruling out iron ore, and when he heated a small fragment with a propane torch, it produced a distinctive yellow-green flame that the book said was characteristic of tungsten. Thomas sat on his porch, staring at the rocks in his hands, trying to process the implications of what he had discovered. If these rocks were indeed tungsten ore, and if there was a significant deposit somewhere on his property or in the surrounding forest, he might be sitting on a fortune. Tungsten was worth thousands of dollars per metric ton, and even a small deposit could be worth millions. But where had Jasper found them? The dog's wanderings covered a wide area, from Thomas's 20-acre property to the thousands of acres of national forest that bordered it. Without knowing the location of the deposit, the discovery was essentially meaningless. Thomas looked at Jasper, who was lying in a patch of sunlight with his tongue lolling out of his mouth. "You're going to have to show me, boy," he said. "You're going to have to take me to where you found these." Jasper lifted his head and wagged his tail, as if he understood exactly what Thomas was asking. The first expedition into the woods was a failure. Thomas followed Jasper into the forest, moving as quickly as his aging body would allow, but the dog ranged too far ahead, disappeared too frequently into thickets and ravines that Thomas couldn't navigate. By the time they had been out for 2 hours, Thomas was exhausted. His leg was throbbing, and he had no clearer idea of where the rocks had come from than when they started. He tried again the next day,
this time keeping Jasper on a long lead that allowed the dog to explore while preventing him from getting too far ahead. This was better, but Jasper clearly resented the restriction, straining against the lead and whining with frustration. They covered more ground, but Thomas still didn't find anything that looked like a deposit of tungsten ore.
The third day brought a breakthrough. Jasper had been particularly agitated that morning, pacing by the door and barking at Thomas with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. When Thomas finally opened the door, the dog shot into the woods like he had been fired from a cannon, disappearing into the trees before Thomas could even think about the lead. Thomas followed as quickly as he could, using the crashing sounds of Jasper's passage as a guide. The dog was moving purposefully, not wandering or exploring as he usually did, but heading in a specific direction with an intensity that Thomas had never seen before. It was almost as if Jasper understood the importance of what they were doing, as if he knew that Thomas needed to be shown something and was determined to deliver. They traveled deeper into the forest than Thomas had ever gone, into areas where the trees grew so thick that the sunlight barely penetrated and the ground was covered with a carpet of fallen leaves that muffled every sound. Thomas's leg was screaming at him to stop, to rest, to turn back, but he pushed through the pain, driven by a determination that surprised him. And then, suddenly, they emerged into a clearing. It was a small opening in the forest, perhaps 50 feet across, dominated by a rocky outcropping that rose from the ground like the back of some ancient beast. The rocks were dark gray, almost black, with veins of lighter material running through them in patterns that Thomas recognized immediately. This was it. This was the source. Thomas approached the outcropping slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran his hands over the surface of the rock, feeling the weight and texture that had become so familiar over the past week. There was no doubt in his mind. This was tungsten ore, a massive deposit of it, exposed by some ancient geological process and hidden in the depths of a forest that people had been walking through for centuries without ever realizing what was there. Jasper sat at the edge of the clearing, watching Thomas with those intelligent eyes. His tail wagged slowly, as if he knew that something important had happened, that his work was finally being recognized.
"Good boy," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Good boy, Jasper. You found it."
The dog barked happily and bounded over to Thomas, accepting the praise with the grace that came naturally to him. Thomas knelt down and wrapped his arms around Jasper's neck, holding him close, feeling the warmth of the dog's body against his own. "You found it," he repeated, whispering now. "You found a fortune hidden in plain sight." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity unlike anything Thomas had experienced since his retirement. He hired a geologist to assess the deposit, swearing the man to secrecy until the full picture could be understood. He researched mineral rights and land ownership, discovering that the outcropping was located just inside the boundary of his property, meaning that whatever was there belonged to him. And he reached out to mining companies, carefully gauging their interest without revealing the full extent of what he had discovered. The geologist's report confirmed everything Thomas had suspected and more. The deposit was significant, one of the largest concentrations of tungsten ore discovered in North America in decades. The initial estimate put the value at somewhere between $50 and $100 million, depending on the market and the costs of extraction. Thomas sat with that number for a long time, trying to make it real in his mind. $50 million, $100 million. Numbers so large that they seemed almost abstract, disconnected from the reality of his daily life. He had never been poor exactly. His military pension and savings were enough to live comfortably, if modestly. But this was different. This was the kind of money that changed everything, that opened doors that had always been closed, that made anything possible. And he owed it all to a dog who had been bringing him strange rocks from the woods. The fame came suddenly and without warning. Thomas had hoped to keep the discovery quiet,
at least until he had a chance to figure out what he wanted to do with it. But word leaked out, as it always does in small communities, and within weeks his story was being covered by newspapers and television stations across the country.
Veteran discovers fortune hidden in plain sight, the headlines read. Dog leads owner to $1 million mineral deposit. The story had everything the media loved: a sympathetic protagonist, an unlikely hero, and a twist that seemed too good to be true. Reporters camped outside Thomas's property, trying to get interviews. Mining companies sent representatives with offers that grew more generous by the day. And strangers wrote letters, some asking for money, and others simply wanting to share in the magic of what had happened. Thomas retreated further into his cabin, overwhelmed by the attention he had never sought and didn't know how to handle. Jasper seemed to sense his distress, staying close by his side, offering the silent comfort that had sustained Thomas through so many dark moments over the years. The dog didn't understand what was happening, didn't know that his habit of bringing home interesting rocks had upended everything. He just knew that his human needed him, and that was enough. It was during this period of chaos that Thomas received a visit that would change the trajectory of everything. Her name was Claire Harrison, and she was the granddaughter of a man named Samuel Harrison, who had owned the property next to Thomas's before the National Forest had been established. She was in her 40s, with gray-streaked brown hair and eyes that held a weariness that Thomas recognized. She was carrying a folder of documents and had a story to tell. Samuel Harrison, she explained, had been a miner who had spent his life searching for valuable minerals in these mountains. He had believed that there was tungsten somewhere on his land, had devoted years to trying to find it, but had died in 1962 without ever locating the deposit. His property had eventually been sold to the government, becoming part of the National Forest, and his dreams of striking it rich had died with him. But Samuel had kept journals, detailed records of his explorations and his theories about where the tungsten might be located. Claire had inherited these journals after her mother's death 2 years ago, and she had been trying to make sense of them ever since. When she heard about Thomas's discovery, she had realized that Samuel had been right all along. The tungsten was there, exactly where he had predicted it would be. He had just been looking on the wrong side of the property line. Thomas listened to Claire's story with a growing sense of unease. The deposit he had discovered was on his land, legally and unambiguously. The mineral rights belonged to him, and there was no claim that Claire or her family could make on the fortune that Jasper had uncovered. But there was something deeply troubling about the situation, a moral dimension that the law couldn't address. Samuel Harrison had spent his life searching for this deposit. He had died believing he had failed, never knowing how close he had come to success. And now Thomas, who had done nothing but follow his dog into the woods, was going to reap the rewards of Samuel's obsession. "What are you hoping for?" Thomas asked Claire. "What do you want from me?" Claire shook her head, a sad smile crossing her face. "I'm not here to ask for money, if that's what you're worried about. I know I have no legal claim to any of this. I just wanted you to know the history, to understand that this deposit meant something to someone before it meant anything to you. My grandfather died thinking he was a failure. I just wanted someone to know that he wasn't." Thomas thought about her words for a long time after she left. He thought about Samuel Harrison, a man he had never met, who had devoted his life to a search that had ultimately consumed him. He thought about Claire, who was asking for nothing but acknowledgement, nothing but recognition of her grandfather's sacrifice. And he thought about himself, about the strange path that had led him from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of North Carolina, to a fortune he had never sought and didn't know what to do with. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than a recognition of something that had always been true. Thomas called Claire the next day and invited her back to the cabin. When she arrived, he handed her a document that his lawyer had prepared overnight. "What is this?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "It's a partnership agreement," Thomas said. "I'm proposing that we develop the deposit together, 50-50 split of the profits. Your grandfather found this tungsten, even if he was never able to prove it.
Without his work, without the knowledge that there was something valuable in these mountains, I never would have known to pay attention when Jasper started bringing me those rocks.
Claire stared at the document, then at Thomas, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't have to do this. I told you I'm not asking for anything."
"I know," Thomas said. "That's exactly why I want to do it. You came here to tell me a story, not to make a claim. You wanted me to know that your grandfather mattered, that his life meant something. This is my way of saying that I heard you, that I understand."
He paused, looking down at Jasper, who was lying at his feet with his head resting on his paws.
"And besides," he continued, "none of this would have happened without Jasper. He's the one who found the rocks. He's the one who led me to the deposit. I'm just the guy who was smart enough to follow him. If I'm going to share the credit, I might as well share it properly."
Claire laughed through her tears, a sound that lightened the weight that had been pressing on Thomas's chest since the discovery had become public. "You're a remarkable man, Thomas Hartley," she said. "I'm just a veteran with a smart dog," Thomas replied. "That's all I've ever been."
The partnership that Thomas and Claire formed became the foundation for something much larger than either of them had imagined. They decided early on that they didn't want to sell the deposit to a large mining company, didn't want to hand over control of the resource to strangers who cared only about profit. Instead, they created their own company, hiring local workers and implementing extraction methods that minimized environmental damage.
The Harrison Hartley Mining Company, as they called it, became a model for responsible resource development. They planted trees to replace those that were cut down. They created wildlife corridors to protect the animals that called the forest home. And they donated a significant portion of their profits to causes that mattered to them: veterans organizations, animal shelters, environmental conservation groups, and scholarships for students from the local community.
Thomas found himself busier than he had been in years, his days filled with meetings and decisions and the constant demands of running a business. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating, a reminder that he was still capable of contributing something meaningful to the world. The isolation he had sought when he first came to these mountains had been necessary for a time, a space for healing and reflection. But he understood now that he had been hiding as much as he had been healing, retreating from life rather than engaging with it. Jasper remained at his side through all of it, a constant presence that grounded Thomas in the reality of his daily existence. The dogs seemed to understand that something important had changed, that their quiet life in the cabin had given way to something larger and more complex. But he adapted with the grace that had always characterized him, accepting the new people and the new routines with the same patience he had shown when Thomas first brought him home from the shelter.
The story of the discovery continued to spread, evolving as it traveled from person to person. Some versions emphasized the rags to riches angle, the veteran who had gone from living alone in a cabin to becoming one of the wealthiest men in the state. Others focused on the partnership with Claire, the unexpected generosity of a man who had shared his fortune with a stranger based on nothing but a sense of fairness.
And still others highlighted the environmental responsibility of the mining operation, holding it up as an example of how resource extraction could be done without destroying the land. But Thomas's favorite versions of the story were the ones that centered on Jasper.
In these tellings, the dog was the true hero, the one who had seen what humans had overlooked for generations. He had wandered into the forest day after day, following his nose and his instincts, bringing back rocks that anyone else would have dismissed as worthless. And through his persistence, through his simple determination to share what he had found with the human he loved, he had changed everything. These stories weren't just about wealth or luck or even love between a man and his dog. They were about paying attention, about being open to what the world was trying to tell you. Thomas had almost thrown away those first rocks, had almost dismissed Jasper's offerings as nothing more than a dog's random behavior. It was only because he had taken the time to look, to really look, that he had understood what he was being given.
That lesson stayed with Thomas as the years passed and the mining operation grew. He tried to bring the same attention to everything he encountered,
the same willingness to see what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. He listened more carefully to the people who worked for him, discovering insights and ideas that would have been lost if he had assumed he already knew everything. He paid closer attention to the land, noticing changes in the forest that suggested how the mining could be done more sustainably. And he spent hours with Jasper, walking through the woods, letting the dog lead him wherever his nose directed, always open to the possibility that another treasure might be waiting to be discovered. The years were kind to Thomas in ways that surprised him. The sense of purpose that the mining operation gave him seemed to push back against the physical deterioration that had been accelerating since his retirement. His step grew lighter, his eyes brighter, his engagement with the world more vital. He was still an old man, still carrying the weight of decades of service and sacrifice, but he was no longer a man in decline. He was a man who had found, against all odds, a reason to keep going. Jasper aged more visibly, as dogs do, his orange fur turning white around his muzzle and his movements growing slower with each passing year. By the time he was 14, he could no longer accompany Thomas on the long walks through the forest that had once been their daily ritual. Instead, he spent most of his time on the porch of the cabin, watching the comings and goings of the mining operation with the same patient attention he had brought to everything in his life. Thomas adjusted his own routines to match Jasper's limitations, spending more time at the cabin and less at the mining site. He had hired good people, had trained them well, and he trusted them to manage the day-to-day operations without his constant oversight. This was his reward, he felt, the freedom to spend his final years with the dog who had made everything possible. They sat together on the porch on countless evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, the light painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Thomas would talk to Jasper about nothing and everything, sharing memories from his years in the service, stories about Patricia that he had never told anyone else, reflections on the strange path his life had taken. Jasper would listen with those intelligent eyes, his tail thumping slowly against the boards of the porch, his presence a comfort that required no words. "You know," Thomas said one evening, as the last light of day faded and the first stars began to appear, "I never would have made it without you. After Patricia died, after I came up here to hide from the world, I was ready to give up. I didn't see the point of anything anymore. And then you came along, with your stupid rocks and your endless enthusiasm, and you reminded me that there was still something worth paying attention to."
Jasper's tail thumped once, a response that Thomas chose to interpret as understanding.
"I know dogs don't think about these things the way humans do," Thomas continued. "I know you were just following your nose, doing what dogs have always done. But it felt like more than that to me. It felt like you were sent to me, like someone or something decided that I needed saving and chose you to do the job." He reached down and scratched behind Jasper's ears, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "Thank you, boy," he said softly. "Thank you for finding me when I was lost. Thank you for showing me what was right in front of my face all along." Jasper passed away in his sleep on a cool October night, exactly 8 years after he had led Thomas to the tungsten deposit. Thomas found him the next morning, lying in his favorite spot on the porch, his body still and peaceful in a way that suggested he had simply decided it was time to go and had slipped away without fuss or fanfare. The grief was overwhelming, a wave that crashed over Thomas and threatened to pull him under. He had known this day was coming, had tried to prepare himself for the loss that was inevitable when you loved a creature with such a short lifespan. But knowing didn't make it easier. Nothing could make it easier. Jasper had been his companion through the most transformative period of his life, the faithful presence that had stood beside him through discovery and fame and the slow process of becoming a better man. Losing him felt like losing a part of himself. He buried Jasper on the edge of the forest, not far from the outcropping where the dog had led him to the tungsten deposit. It seemed fitting that Jasper should rest near the site of his greatest discovery, the place where his wandering nose had changed both their lives forever. Thomas marked the grave with a simple stone, carved with words that tried to capture what Jasper had meant to him. Jasper. He found what was hidden and shared it with love. The funeral, if it could be called that, was attended by more people than Thomas had expected. Word had spread through the community about Jasper's passing, and dozens of people came to pay their respects to the dog who had become a local legend. There were mining company employees who had known Jasper from his days at the site. There were neighbors who had watched him age over the years, and there were strangers who had heard the story and wanted to be part of its conclusion. Claire was there, of course, standing beside Thomas as he said goodbye to his oldest friend. She had become more than a business partner over the years, more than a fellow steward of Samuel Harrison's legacy. She had become family, the sister Thomas had never had, the connection to a world beyond his cabin.
"He was a remarkable dog," Claire said, as the crowd began to disperse. "I know everyone says that about their pets, but Jasper really was different. There was something about the way he looked at you, like he understood more than he should."
Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak.
"He changed everything," Claire continued. "Not just for you, but for the whole community. The jobs we've created, the scholarships we've funded, the land we've protected. None of it would exist without that dog and his strange rocks."
Thomas finally found his voice. He was just doing what dogs do, he said, following his nose, bringing home what he found. "I'm the one who almost missed it. I'm the one who almost threw those rocks away without looking at them."
But you didn't, Claire said. That's the point. You paid attention. You took the time to understand what he was trying to tell you. That's not nothing, Thomas. That's everything.
The words stayed with Thomas in the weeks and months that followed, a comfort during the dark times when Jasper's absence felt unbearable. He found himself thinking about all the moments he had almost overlooked, all the times he had been too distracted or too weary to pay attention to what was right in front of him. Patricia's quiet signs of love that he had sometimes taken for granted, the beauty of the mountains that had been invisible to him during his years of grief. And yes, the strange rocks that a dog had been bringing him from the woods.
Life was full of treasures hidden in plain sight, Thomas realized. They were there for anyone who was willing to look, anyone who could set aside their assumptions and see what was actually present rather than what they expected to find. Jasper had taught him that lesson through example, through his simple determination to share what he had discovered, through his trust that Thomas would eventually understand. It was a lesson Thomas vowed never to forget.
The Harrison Hartley Mining Company continued to thrive in the years after Jasper's death, growing into one of the most successful and responsible mining operations in the country. Thomas remained involved as a consultant and figurehead, lending his name and his wisdom to the enterprise that his dog had made possible. But the day-to-day management passed to younger people, professionals who had the energy and expertise to take the company to the next level.
Thomas used his share of the profits to create a foundation in Jasper's name, dedicated to causes that would have made the dog proud. The Jasper Foundation funded animal shelters across the state, helping dogs like the frightened creature Thomas had found at that shelter in Asheville find loving homes. It supported veterans programs, connecting former soldiers with therapy animals who could provide the same companionship and purpose that Jasper had given Thomas. And it funded environmental education, teaching young people to pay attention to the natural world, to notice the treasures hidden in plain sight all around them. The foundation became Thomas's legacy, the way he chose to honor the dog who had saved him. He traveled to schools and community centers, telling the story of Jasper and the strange rocks, encouraging people to open their eyes to the possibilities that surrounded them. He became, in his final years, a sort of ambassador for attention, a living reminder that the world was full of wonders for those who were willing to see them. He adopted another dog, of course. 2 years after Jasper's death, he brought home a young golden retriever mix named Scout, who reminded him of Jasper in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Scout was his own dog, with his own personality and quirks, but he had the same intelligent eyes and the same patient presence that had characterized Jasper. And he had his own habit of wandering into the woods and bringing back treasures, though nothing he found ever matched the value of those first strange rocks. Thomas didn't mind.
The tungsten had been a gift, a once-in-a-lifetime discovery that had changed everything. But the real treasure had never been the ore itself. It had been the lesson Jasper had taught him, the reminder that life was full of hidden riches for those who paid attention. Scout continued that lesson in his own way, bringing home interesting leaves and unusual feathers, and once, memorably, a turtle that he had somehow managed to carry without harming.
Thomas received each offering with the same attention he had eventually learned to give to Jasper's rocks. He examined them, considered their significance, and thanked Scout for sharing what he had found. Most of them ended up in a pile by the porch, worthless by any objective measure, but precious in their own way. They were evidence of Scout's love, his desire to share his discoveries with the human who meant everything to him.
And that made them valuable beyond any price the market could assign.
Thomas passed away peacefully at the age of 78, 15 years after Jasper had first led him to the tungsten deposit. He died in his cabin, in the bed he had built with his own hands, with Scout lying beside him and the first light of dawn painting the mountains outside his window. It was a good death, the kind that everyone hopes for but few achieve, a gentle closing of eyes at the end of a life well lived.
The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the impact Thomas had made during his final years. There were veterans he had helped through the foundation, some of them accompanied by therapy dogs who sat quietly at their feet. There were former employees of the mining company, many of whom had started as laborers and risen to positions of responsibility through the opportunities Thomas had created.
There were students who had received scholarships, teachers who had used the foundation's educational materials, environmentalists who had worked alongside the company to protect the land. And there were dog lovers from across the region, people who had never met Thomas but who felt connected to him through the story of Jasper and the strange rocks.
Claire delivered the eulogy, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. She spoke about the man she had come to know, the veteran who had sought isolation and found community, the grieving widower who had learned to love again, the reluctant businessman who had built an empire on principles of fairness and responsibility.
And she spoke about the dog who had started it all, the faithful companion who had seen what no one else could see and had refused to let it go unnoticed.
Thomas used to say that Jasper found the fortune and he just followed along, Claire said, her voice carrying across the crowd. But that's not quite right. What Jasper found was a bunch of rocks. What Thomas found was the wisdom to pay attention, the courage to act on what he discovered, and the generosity to share it with others. The fortune was never in the ground. It was in his heart all along. They buried Thomas next to Patricia, in a cemetery in Virginia where they had always planned to rest together. But a part of him remained in the Blue Ridge Mountains, in the cabin he had built, and the forest he had loved, and the legacy he had created. The Harrison Hartley Mining Company continued its work, still guided by the principles Thomas had established. The Jasper Foundation expanded its reach, touching thousands of lives each year.
And the story of the veteran and his dog continued to spread, inspiring people to pay attention to the world around them, to notice the treasures hidden in plain sight. Scout lived for another 5 years after Thomas's death, cared for by Claire and her family until he peacefully passed at the age of 12. He was buried beside Jasper, near the tungsten outcropping, with his own stone that read, Scout. He carried on the tradition.
The two dogs rest together now, in the shadow of the forest they love to explore, guardians of a legacy that extends far beyond the tungsten ore that made Thomas wealthy. They represent something more valuable than any mineral, more precious than any fortune. They represent the power of love to transform lives, the importance of paying attention, and the truth that the greatest treasures are often the ones we almost overlook. The site has become a place of pilgrimage for some, visitors who make the trek into the woods to see where it all began. They stand before the outcropping, now carefully managed to balance extraction with preservation, and they think about the story they have heard. A dog bringing strange rocks from the woods, a veteran who almost threw them away, a discovery that changed everything.
And then they go back to their own lives, carrying with them a question that Thomas always hoped they would ask. What treasures are hidden in plain sight in my own life? What gifts am I overlooking? What is the world trying to tell me, if only I would pay attention?
Those are the questions that matter, the questions that Jasper answered through his simple persistence, his unwavering determination to share what he had found. The tungsten was just the beginning, the opening of eyes that had been closed too long. The real treasure was learning to see, learning to notice, learning to receive the gifts that life offers to everyone who is willing to look.
That is the legacy of a dog who brought strange rocks from the woods. That is the fortune that Thomas Hartley discovered, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to pay attention.
And that is the gift that continues to give, rippling outward through time, touching lives that Jasper and Thomas never knew, reminding the world that the greatest discoveries often come from the most unexpected places. All you have to do is look.